It is 1940. It is a very peaceful time in French Indochina. Have you heard the news? France has been taken over by Germany. Gather the people. Bring them all to the main square. The time for independence has come. And 1 year later, the Viet Minh were finally created. With the end of the Second World War in 1945, the Viet Minh declared independence in the vacuum of power that was left behind by the superpowers. A very short independence, in fact. Well, the short reign of freedom can be described like a bag on the street. Ho Chi Minh has found the bag on the street. The French want their so-called bag back. After World War II, Vietnam was separated into the North and South. The North was controlled by the Chinese, and the South was occupied by the British at the time. Of course, France wanted its bag back, so they stuck to the British. They stuck uncomfortably close to the British. Well, with France trying to come back and take Vietnam, in 1946, with the French and the Viet Minh began the very first Indochina War. This war lasted until 1954, in which Vietnam finally gained its independence from France. Now at this point, the territory of Vietnam was split in two by a partition so that everyone could chill out a bit, so that there could later be elections and then reunite the country. Well, in that time, for South Vietnam, a man called Ngo Dio Dien, I probably butchered that name, came into rule. As for the leader of North Vietnam, remember the leader of Vietnam? Yeah, he became the leader of North Vietnam. And also, he is a communist, while Ngo Dinh Dien is a man of democracy. So now, with two different sides, with two different regimes, the Second Indochina War, otherwise known as the Vietnam War, which will be one of the longest and the deadliest proxy wars that has ever been fought during the entire history of the Cold War. It all started on 1955 when Ngo Dinh Dien came into power. His cruel politics drove people in the south of Vietnam to create many resistance groups, which later accumulated to the National Liberation Front, later known as by most as the Viet Cong. This group of fighters did not actually fight in conventional ways of warfare, however. The Viet Cong used a strategy that is currently called guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong raided the South Vietnam Army multiple times, all while being supported by North Vietnam, receiving supplies from North Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail that traverses through Laos and Cambodia. President John F. Kennedy decided to send supplies and advisors to South Vietnam at 1963 in order to help with defending the country. Kennedy did not want to send in any sort of actual fighting force, however, as he still thought at the time that South Vietnam has to deal with it all on its own. In the same year, however, South Vietnam's army faced a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Viet Cong, who numbered 350, versus the South Vietnam's army of 1,500. In 1963, officers of South Vietnam rose up against the government, capturing and later killing the corrupt leadership of Nickelodeon, the USS Maddox was supposedly attacked by North Vietnam twice, allowing the president to send American troops into Vietnam without an actual declaration of war. These US troops landed on March 8, 1965. Afterward, the new leaders, Kai and Thieu, take a lead at 1965. And Olaf struck a US helicopter facility in Pleiku. In retaliation to this attack, the US sent bombing operations into North Vietnam, including Operation Flaming Dart, Rolling Thunder, and Operation Arclight. In another operation, called Barrel Roll, the US bombed Laos in hope of cutting off access to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. An operation that ended up only being a test for napalm, a sticky new flammable chemical that is awfully good at taking out forest and vegetation. Basically, a weapon that just causes a lot of problems, especially with deforestation. By that time, the head of South Vietnam was changed to Nguyen Cao Khai, who with some rough policies brought some stability to South Vietnam's government. At the same time, the US called in pseudo allies, otherwise known as the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, to send troops to aid in the war against North Vietnam. However, even with the 3-point plan of attack, there was a pretty big lack of progress. In 1966, President Johnson, despite all of these situations, he kept lying to the public about everything that was going on in Vietnam, saying that everything was going according to plan and that there was nothing to be worried about. This is after the US had many advancements in technology and had way superior firepower. They even had atom bombs that could destroy cities in one go. While North Vietnam and Viet Cong knew the land really well. They literally knew the land like the back of their hands, maybe even more than that, and also had a great amount of support from the people in South Vietnam. Then, in 1967, Nguyen Van Thieu became president of South Vietnam, his presidency lasting until 1975. The next year, 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong and North Vietnam launched an seemingly massive offensive against the South. This offensive actually took everyone far too much by surprise. Somewhere around this time as well, the gruesome battles of war were transmitted to the US by good old television. The media coverage in the battlefield differed so much from what President Johnson's reports to the public that he lost a great amount of credibility and support. Because of this, such a contrast, the people's view of the war and Johnson deteriorated quite rapidly. All the support of the war and of the president hitting an all-time low, the US began peace talks with North Vietnam in Paris in May 1968. This resulted in a slight ceasefire, with all US bombing of the North being halted. So, I guess no more fireworks for North Vietnam. At this point, Johnson left office, and President Richard Nixon came into the role of president in 1969. With the people of the US being against the war, and with the war being almost unwinnable by any sort of view, Nixon started to withdraw some troops from Vietnam the very same year. The US later invaded Cambodia in 1970 in order to remove communism that was rising up in Cambodia. Later the same year, South Vietnam attempted to invade Laos to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1972, North Vietnam and the left began another offensive against the South. Because of this, the US recommenced the bombing of North Vietnam in an operation known as Linebacker. In 1973, after some negotiation, the US stopped any sort of offensive they had in Vietnam, stopped the draft that had been going in the US for a while now, and also signed the Paris Accords, which ended the involvement of US in any conflict in Vietnam. And on April 30, 1975, North Vietnam forces entered Saigon, raising this beautiful flag. And this was the end of the Vietnam War. Now, Saigon was now renamed as the Ho Chi Minh City. And all of the US fears of the domino effect never came into actual play, as communism stopped in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It did not spread to India and nothing else. So, was this war in the end entirely worth it? For so many lives lost and so much destruction in Vietnam. Was it worth it? The US embarrassed itself in a conflict that in the end had no real effect in anything. Was it worth it for the US to jump into a conclusion?